The sky hung like a leaden smoke. The sun, as if ashamed, hid behind the hazy clouds, watching the city from afar. Here, people built cities out of sand. But these sand cities were not like the innocent castles a child might build on the beach. Each grain of sand was kneaded with the sweat, the blood of a soldier, a child, a mother. In the very center of the city stood the great hammer. It was a 7-headed hammer. Each head belonged to a different master. The hammer masters were considered the most respected people of the city. Their names were never spoken, their faces never seen. Only when the shadows of the hammers fell over the city did everyone know they were there. The people of the Sand City gathered every morning in the square before the sun rose. In their hands were small shovels, on their shoulders, silence. For the shadow of the great hammer commanded them, "Build again," and they obeyed. Sand walls would rise, towers would be erected, moats would be dug. Even the children were part of this order. They carried sand with their small hands, adding it to the structure, knowing it would be destroyed the next day. There was a young stonemason named Aras. His face was covered with dust, his hands always wounded, but in his eyes burned a spark of rebellion. He wanted the sand walls to one day last. One day he asked his master, "Master, why do we destroy every day what we built the day before?" The master, without even lifting his head, replied, "Because destruction is a ritual, a cleansing. Without destruction the city becomes impure." The hammer masters know. Aras was not satisfied with this answer. At night, he secretly climbed the highest tower, gazed at the sky and watched the sand city, and every time the silence that followed the destruction felt like death to him. One day the shadow of the great hammer fell longer than ever before. The hammer masters descended into the square. When the hammers struck the ground like thunder, the sand walls collapsed at once. Everyone applauded, for this was the sacred moment of destruction. But Aras did not applaud, because in that moment he saw that with every collapsing wall, people's dreams and children's games were also being buried. That night he had a dream. In the dream, a voice told him, "Every wall that is destroyed will return harder when rebuilt. When sand mixes with blood, it turns to stone." When he woke up, his heart was pounding, for he understood that this cycle was slowly turning the city's people into stone. A few days later, a ceremony was held in the city. The masters gathered in the square, holding swords made of sand. Children lined up to watch these swords. The swords were broken one by one. This breaking ceremony was a sign that war was near, for whenever swords were broken, real swords would be forged the next day. Aras could no longer bear this cycle. One of the elders of the city whispered to him, "This city cannot exist without war. The source of the sand is the ruins of destroyed cities. Without ruins there is no sand. Without sand there is no city." These words struck Aras like a dagger, so they could not exist without destruction. One night Aras thought of leaving the city. Outside he imagined there would be soil instead of sand, soil that could grow green, soil where peace might be hidden. But the city gates were not made of iron, they were made of fear. Passing through that fear was not easy. There were guards at the tops of the towers, holding not real swords but spears made of sand. But even the shadow of those spears was enough to stop people, for here shadow was stronger than light. One morning Aras did not destroy the wall he had built with his own hands. He dropped his shovel to the ground. The other workers looked at him, but no one said anything. That wall stood for days without being torn down. The hammer masters noticed this defiance. At midnight their shadows fell upon the wall, and the wall collapsed by itself. The next morning a handful of bloody sand was found at Aras's door. This was a warning. Obey the rule, or you will be destroyed like the wall. Aras was afraid for the first time, but at the same time he felt alive for the first time, because fear reminded him of his longing for freedom. One day the great hammer struck harder than ever before. The sand city was completely razed. People shouted with joy, because this meant the great cleansing. But Aras remained silent. He walked alone among the ruins and picked up a child's toy shovel from the ground. Perhaps, he said to himself, the greatest act of rebellion is not to destroy, but to stop building. That night no one built a new wall. People looked at each other in silence for the first time. The shadow of the great hammer fell over the city, but this time no one lifted their shovels. The shadow trembled for a moment, then withdrew. Aras knew this was a beginning. If the shadow withdrew, perhaps one day the sun would truly appear. When the walls of the sand city were destroyed for the last time, the people's hands were empty. The shovels remained stuck in the ground. No one lifted them. When the sun rose, the sky was brighter, but something new began to sprout from beneath the soil. Iron trees. These trees had no leaves. Their trunks were a rusty red, their branches sharp, as if reaching not toward the sky but toward people's hearts. At first, no one understood what they were, but soon silvery drops began to flow from the roots of the iron trees. These drops were molten iron. One morning, foreign merchants came to the city. They brought large crucibles and forges. They collected the iron drops, melted them, shaped them. They did not tell what they were making, but everyone could see. Swords, spears, maces, armor. And for the first time, people touched the cold gleam of metal instead of sand. Weapons were not as easily destroyed as sand walls. They were more permanent. This permanence gave people a false sense of security. The merchants told the people, "These trees will bring you prosperity. The more weapons you make, the stronger you will be." The people loved these words, for now they no longer had to build and destroy walls every day. Weapons had become power itself, but the iron trees were not ordinary trees. They did not need water to grow. They needed blood. Whenever there was a fight in the city, whenever a drop of blood fell to the ground, the trees doubled in size overnight. The hammer masters noticed this. They held a meeting. "These trees are our new order," they said. "We no longer need to rule with shadows. People will shed blood of their own will." And so it happened. Small disputes were magnified, quarrels encouraged. Every day there was a fight in the city, and at the end of each fight, the trees grew even more. Aras would sit at the foot of the trees and listen to their roots. Sometimes he could hear voices coming from the roots. The roots whispered, "More blood, more fear. If we do not grow, the city dies." These voices terrified Aras, for now he realized that the survival of the city depended on people harming each other. This was more dangerous than destruction. Destruction was like a ritual, but this order demanded blood continuously. The merchants set up a large market in the city. Stalls displayed swords, arrows, armor. People bought the weapons and took them home. At first they hung them on their walls like decorations, but soon they wanted to taste the feeling of power that came from using them. Even children played with small iron knives. Every game ended with blood, and each drop made the iron trees lusher, more magnificent. In the middle of the market, Aras shouted, "These trees are consuming you. One day their roots will cover all the soil, and nothing will grow again." But no one listened to him, for in people's eyes the shadow of the trees had become a sacred refuge. A new law was passed in the city. Every household had to offer a sacrifice to the iron trees once a year. This sacrifice could be an animal, but most of the time people denounced each other and declared others enemies, because the fresher the blood, the faster the tree grew. In time, these sacrifices became a festival. People danced, sang songs, and even rejoiced while shedding blood. This joy hurt Aras's heart even more, for now violence was no longer something to fear, but something to celebrate. One night Aras took his axe and struck the trunk of the largest iron tree. Sparks flew, but the tree was not cut down. A scream rose from the roots. That scream woke the entire city. People gathered and saw Aras. "This man attacked the sacred tree," they shouted. They captured Aras and brought him to the center of the square. The hammer masters decided, "Aras will be buried in the roots of the trees. His blood will give them strength." But at that moment, something unexpected happened. The trees did not want blood. They bent their branches toward Aras, as if to protect him. For Aras's courage had whispered a new voice into their roots. Peace is enough for growth, not blood. For the first time the trees bloomed, small red flowers. The people were astonished. These red flowers became the symbol of peace, not blood. But the merchants did not want this, for if they could not sell weapons, they could not profit. Secretly they poured poison into the roots. The next morning the trees began to thirst for blood again. Aras decided to leave the city to break this cycle. He took with him a few people, those who had left their weapons behind and who had not forgotten the moment when the trees had bloomed. Together they walked to distant lands. Perhaps one day they could return and free the iron trees completely. When Aras and his companions left the city, they walked for days. The shadow of the sand city shrank behind them. The silhouettes of the iron trees remained on the horizon. One day they reached a valley, the Valley of Mirrors. At first glance, the valley was silent. There was no bird song, no whisper of wind, but every side of the valley gleamed. Thousands of mirrors were placed on the rock faces. Each mirror reflected the sky, the earth, the people walking from a different angle. When Aras looked into the first mirror, he saw his own face, but it was blurred as if time had erased it. His companion Miran looked into a mirror and saw not his own face, but a battle scene. Weapons, screams, smoke. Everyone who stepped into the valley saw in the mirrors their own fear, their deepest desire, or their most hidden guilt. For some, it was a fascinating spectacle. People camped in the valley and sat in front of the mirrors for hours. After a while, something strange happened in the valley. People stopped speaking, because the mirrors were constantly telling them something. The language of the mirrors was silent but mesmerizing. Aras tried not to fall under the mirror's spell. But one night, sleepless, he saw in a mirror that the sand city was being rebuilt and that the roots of the iron trees were going deeper. In the middle of the valley there was a giant mirror. They called it the Great Mirror. People sat in front of this mirror and watched on a single surface all the scenes of violence happening around the valley. This was far more exciting than the destruction ceremonies in the city square. Over time, people did not just watch the violence, they began to applaud it. Because in the mirrors, violence looked like an aesthetic dance. One day, Miran said to Aras, "Perhaps these images are our reality. If they look so beautiful, maybe violence is not evil." Aras replied angrily, "This beauty is poisonous. By watching suffering, we become part of it." But no matter how much Aras warned, people did not want to leave the valley. For the mirrors were giving them both their fears and their desires. Aras noticed that those who stared into the mirrors for too long began to have blurred faces even in real life. Their eyes became vacant, their voices faded. Soon there was a silent, expressionless crowd in the valley. One day he could no longer see his own reflection in the great mirror. At that moment he realized he too was starting to disappear. He touched his face, felt his skin, but the mirrors no longer showed him. Aras decided to leave the valley. Only a few joined him. Most people were still under the spell of the mirrors. Before leaving, Aras looked at the great mirror one last time and shouted, "You will not deceive us. You cannot adorn violence." The mirror turned red for a moment, then cracked. From the crack spilled thousands of images, children's screams, mothers' laments, collapsing houses, fire raining from the sky. The valley trembled. Most of the mirrors shattered. People suddenly looked around as if waking from a dream. Their faces became visible again. Tears ran down their cheeks. As Aras and his companions left the valley, they called out to those who stayed, "Now you have seen your faces. A person who sees their own face can no longer live as before. Either they will return to the mirrors, or they will choose a new path." When they came out of the valley, the sun was shining. But Aras knew that the sand city and the iron trees were still there. Only the mirrors had been broken. To uproot war, they would have to go back. When they returned, the city had turned into something else. Sand mixed with blood had become stone. Stone, the breath buried beneath it. The sky sagged with a rusty redness. Smoke from burnt houses clung to the horizon. The branches of the iron trees were intertwined, weaving a cage-like shadow, as if the sky had lowered an iron curtain between itself and the city. The weapons of the guards at the gates shattered the sunlight with their glare. Aras thought that this brightness was not dazzling but blinding. The smell of the city had changed. Salt, smoke, blood, and the stench of a melted plastic toy. For a moment, the wind carried the smell of the sea from outside the city. Aras sensed that this was the smell of Gaza's shores. This sea strikes the city like a lullaby trapped between stones, he thought. When they reached the square, a large circle, the wordless ring, had formed. In the middle knelt a child with a sack over his head. Outside the circle lay broken tiles, a burnt stovepipe, a crushed piece of bread. The hammer masters no longer carried hammers. Their place had been taken by swords that hid blood with their shine. The masters' faces had no expression, only a gaze that said, "You will not see this." Aras recognized the child. He had been one who had stayed the longest in the Valley of Mirrors. He had learned the truth of the city from the reflections and returned to tell it in the square. People had listened. Some cried, some gathered stones, some silently shut their windows. The hammer masters wanted to stop this seeing, for seen truth damaged sales. Aras leapt forward. "Stop!" he cried. His voice struck the stones of the square and scattered. In the circle no words were accepted. Here words were crushed at the feet of actions. Aras stood before the child. The masters raised their swords. The iron trees rustled, for even iron sometimes trembles like a leaf. At that moment the ground spoke. From the foundations of fallen houses, from the cracks plastered with sand, from the capillaries of ruins rose a voice. First a whisper, then a chorus growing with the wind. "Do not forget us." This sentence folded like a paper and unfolded. As it opened, names spilled out, each one as small as a grain of sand, each one as heavy as a rock. Names seeped between the stones, each seep turned into a red line. Aras saw that the drying lines on the stones curled like a map, and that this map traced the streets of Gaza, its alleys, the labyrinth of the rubble. "This soil has a name," Aras said aloud. "This soil is Gaza." The crowd stirred. A woman pressed her hand to her heart, as if clutching a burnt window frame. A man licked the sea salt mixed with dust on his arm, as if trying to remember the sea by smearing it on his thirst. The leader of the hammer masters pointed the tip of his sword at Aras's chest. "Names are a marketplace," he said. His voice hummed like a forge where iron meets oil. "Names are truth," said Aras. "When sold they diminish, when shared they grow." For a moment the sword hung in the air. In that moment the iron trees bent down to the level of the people. In the hollows of their branches were toy fragments, a lone shoe, a crushed tin car, a half-burnt rag doll. The branches carried these objects, parading them above the square. With each passing piece a sigh, and a murmur rose from the crowd. The murmurs joined together, spreading words to the lips of the wordless ring. "We have seen," said a young man. "We have heard," said an old man. "We believe," said a grief-stricken mother. "Ah, Gaza," they all said together, and this single word resounded like a hammer blow that cracked the metal of the swords. The masters did not retreat, for to retreat was to withdraw the income born of habit. They raised their swords again. Sunlight made a spectacle glitter on the blades. Part of the crowd, as if turned back to the mirrors, was captivated by this glitter. Aras remembered the Valley of Mirrors. When violence is made beautiful, spectators multiply. He raised his hands and cast a shadow over the glare. "Do not look," he said. "Sometimes the first condition of seeing is to narrow your eyes. Unless you narrow them, you cannot see the ugliness. See Gaza with its full name." The silence fell. Silence was the shape of a scream. The silence grew. As it grew, the arms holding the master's swords grew heavy. The roots of the iron trees crawled under the stones of the square and brushed the master's ankles. In that touch there was no blood, there was water. Water silently shared one night. The roots whispered, "Justice is enough for growth, not blood." Aras knelt. He pressed his palms to the earth. The earth was warm, beating like a pulse. "This is Gaza's soil," he said. "What is buried here is not just a body. What is buried is the world's shame. If they are silent, shame grows. If they speak, it shrinks. People looked into each other's eyes. To meet a gaze was a pact of witnessing. The rings of the circle loosened. Hands found one another beneath locked arms. A child came to Aras and removed the sack from his head. His eyes were not the color of the sea. The sea was like a waterway walking from within his eyes toward the throat. "My name is gone," the child whispered. "My name has mixed into the stones." "We will gather the names," said Aras. "We will turn every stone over. We will not forget." The masters shouted, "Forgetting is freedom." Aras answered, "Forgetting is the quietest complicity in a crime." The crowd said, "We will not forget." First in a low voice, then in a sound swelling like a wave. As the voice rose, the branches of the iron trees blossomed. Not red this time, but salt-white flowers as if made of sea foam. The flowers settled on the backs of the swords. The metal could not bear the weight of the blossoms, heard its own voice, and cracked. For the first time the sky opened. When it opened, it did not complete itself into blue. It left a void. The void was for mourning. Without mourning there is no justice. Without justice there is no peace. Only a counterfeit spectacle. The crowd sensed this. The wordless ring turned into spoken witness. Everyone told a detail they had seen. There was a bakery on the corner of that street. On that wall a drawing of a cartoon hero. On that house's terrace a white dove perched. In that window a curtain incensed by fire. These tellings filled the gaps between the stones of the square step by step like letters. In the middle of the city an unseen text took shape, one that everyone walked over. The name of that text was a single word, Gaza. As the roots of the iron trees read this word, they began to draw water. As they drew water, not weapons but shade hung from their branches. For the first time a shade spread over the people, not to protect them, but to help them listen. In that shade Aras stood up. He took the child's hand and turned to the crowd. "Today we did not break a sword. We broke the eye that displays the sword. That eye is the accustomed eye, not a blind eye, merely a watching eye. The show is over now. From this point on, every image will turn into a sentence of testimony." The masters said, "When the market ends, life ends." Aras said, "When the market ends, life begins." The crowd murmured, "Life," as if speaking that word for the first time. By day's end, no walls remained and no commands. Only small shoots rising from between the stones, thin green sprouts like olive leaves. A woman seeing the shoots covered her face with both hands, not from weeping, but because she could finally believe. A child set the wheel of a burned toy beside the sprouts, as if saying to the soil, "Do not forget us as you grow." The sun rose upon the city as if rising over Gaza's ruined homes. But this rising was not an over, it was a within. For now the city knew itself by passing through Gaza. There were still black clouds on the horizon, but this time the clouds were not to cast a shadow. They were a warning. If you forget, the circle will form again. Aras lifted his head. "Along the edge of the clouds a thin line of light," he said. "As long as we remember, the circle has only one name left, human." And that day, the iron trees gave shade. Beneath the shade, no one held a weapon. Only names were gathered, stones were turned over, letters were set. Gaza was read aloud in a whisper, as a lullaby, as a lament, and most of all, by refusing to be silent. For sometimes the greatest word is the refusal of silence.